Now we are going to move on to the wider Imperium, the likes who serve the Emperor of Man, who swore to protect him against any force of Xenos or Chaos threats who would go to extinguish him. So who is going to be first up on the Imperium list? First up on the Imperium list is going to be Adeptus Mechanicus, or as they're most commonly referred to, just AdMech. Now, Adeptus Mechanicus basically worship machines as god, manufacturing hundreds of thousands of metallic weapons, vehicles, robotic mechanics for any assault of the Imperium for any request that the Imperium needs, and basically turning their flesh to metal into terms to worship their own gods, which are the machines that control them or create them in the first place. This be through the units that have like some kind of like flesh / metal augmentations. Now, how do the Adeptus Mechanicus play on the actual tabletop? Now, AdMech basically play into creating big gun lines and then shooting the heck out of them. They're not necessarily a very melee-centric army. They have some dedicated melee units, but mainly focused on creating combination shooting, which allows you to be either really offensive or really defensive. Now, as for their strength, they got some really good steampunk-looking vibes. Some of their units, like their Breacher teams or their Skitarii units, look very steampunk, very combination between messy and clean. And I think it looks really nice if you're looking to paint some more advanced models, especially like the Breacher teams, and just give yourself more of a challenge in terms of combining terms of regular old human world to like past old kind of scrappy put together Mechanicus kind of way. Basically describing the exact word Mechanicus. Now, they have a codex, which makes them very, very flexible in terms of what you're going to build, whether that be the cybernetic cohort, which wants you to take like bigger, more punchy robots, or like larger dedicated transport shooter units, or the Skitarii hunter cohort, which is going to focus on like a bit more melee-centric, and the tech priest one, which allows you to have certain scoring objectives, which is also quite cool. You can basically move into multiple flexible options and pick whatever one suits your way. But how do AdMech work? Now, AdMech work very purposely into their own, into their army rule, which is the Doctrine Imperative, which basically allows you to choose between two different stages of the AdMech. The AdMech can either be really defensive, or they can be really aggressive. So, for example, their weapons can get heavy, or their weapons can get assault. And you can have like an AP corrosion or like an AP modifier. So it's basically like, okay, do I want to push up this round, or do I want to be really defensive this round? And that's what really depends on how you can play AdMech. So suddenly, if you really need to get into combat and you need to be able to make that advance and charge, you can get all your weapons can have assault, and you can charge and get it. Or if you're looking at maybe staying back and like, okay, I need to get better shooting, I can attain with the defensive version of it. And what's really, really cool is that usually in most things, most of their enhancements work through basically the tech priest giving the regular breacher teams or whoever they're going to be following orders. So, for example, I make you better at shooting, I make you better at moving, and basically like being in certain situations, so you can design specific squads very specifically in terms of what they need to do. So you can put a tech priest on top of them, have that tech priest assign a certain role, and then basically perform that role in whatever is needed. So if you need that role to be very fast, you need that role to be very specifically shooty, and then you can combine that with the Doctrine Imperative to basically choose like, okay, this unit needs to be fast, so let's get them with the assault one and get them moving up. Sadly, you can only use it with specific units who have like the specific keywords to do it, but it's still very, very cool with that general theme. And the detachment rules, which like usually allow within like the regular detachment, which is the Red Zone Corpse, which allows you to basically infect the opponent's zone and create like this weird haze where it does like D3 mortal wounds if you stay in a specific zone, pushing them forward, allowing you to get that heavy gun line. And a lot of their units, like their big like Primarch-ish unit, it's very powerful, and they have a lot of Aurora kind of ways, and they work very well into just good shooting. Now, basically to their weaknesses, AdMech have super expensive models. A lot of their models come in at high prices, and it's not very good for beginners to enjoy. So if you're looking at collecting like a really nice army of AdMech, like basic breacher teams or Skitarii hunters or whatever you need to do, it can be quite painful to just like invest in them. So if you're looking for a cheaper unit, I would not recommend AdMech. And even with the buffs, they're still a very, very weak unit. They're not a very flexible unit. in terms of shooting, because you always have to shoot, and even with the Skitarii Hunter cohort, it's very hard to find some kind of eccentric melee unit, and they're basically just like, it's supposed to be glass cannons. Basically, what they need to be is perfect glass cannons, but instead of glass cannons, they're more like glass pistols. They shoot and they die, so it's really hard to get yourself, even with good shooting, the Tech Priest buffs, and all the different ways you can play them, it's still quite hard to position themselves, and comparing to other armies, they just don't play necessarily very well. But that doesn't mean you cannot still take them. They are one of the worst armies currently right now, but if you want to play AdMech and you believe that you can work really well with the Tech Priest abilities, the red zone corpse with affecting the player's zone, or playing very heavily into Skitarii Hunters, or like the Cybernetic cohort, or cohort Cybernetica, and you really like the idea of like playing in a certain way, assigning your army either like the assault, like the attack doctrine, or like the defense doctrine, and being a specific way in every time, having some heavy shooting units and playing with a more cyberpunk-ish vibe while getting some nice damage off, you can consider Adeptus Mechanicus. But let's move on to the second and probably one of my favorite Imperium factions. Now we move on to the second Imperium kind of faction, which is the Imperial Guard, or as I call them, the Masters of Indirect Fire. Basically, if your every single day man soldier was to fight up against these aliens, super soldiers, demons, crazy mutated monsters, what would they do? And turns out it's a lot of bloody guns. Basically, what happens when all these men have to fight in all these different situations and perform 99.9% of the fights that happen in the Imperium to protect man, what they need to bring. And that is, like I said, a lot of guns. But how they play in the general play style of Warhammer 40k? Well, you see, they're going to be basically building really large infantry, tank, or artillery squads. They're going to absolutely level head the enemy no matter how much you push on them. This means combining infantry and tank, or infantry and artillery, or a nice combination of the three, or going heavy into one to really level the enemy whatever way suits you best. Now, what are their strengths? They are really good at having a lot of guns. Things like their tanks, like their Leman Russes, or their Rogel Dawns, or their battery artillery shells, all have a lot of guns. So sure, you're hitting on maybe like 4s or even 3s, but now you have 30 attacks to save. So do whatever you want with that. And some things like their shock troopers and like the big fire getting from vehicles is just crazy. Especially your what is it called? The Bombast field gun, I believe, which does crazy indirect fire and just allows for insane damage to be dealt in any way possible. Next is going to be their army rule, which is Voice of Command, which allows officer units to basically give commands to squads. So this could be like movement buffs, OC buffs, shooting buffs, whatever you need. You need to go to ground, you need to charge up here, and you need to do that. And different officers offer different amounts of points that you can basically give your infantry squads, and the stratagems and enhancements actually work a lot more around doing those kind of things. So maybe giving more points to actually give commands to, or giving abilities to combine the commands and make them like even stronger. And their strategy enhancements all kind of work into as well as that into indirect fire, which some of them actually work with indirect fire, counteracting the entire -1 to hit. So that's why I did call them the Masters of Indirect, because things like their artillery battery shells who have heavy amounts of indirect fire, you can really bring down the pain with the amount of indirect fire you're bringing, especially from like some of their bigger units who have like the one-shot guns with the massive missiles, or the Rogel Dawns, like huge artillery missiles, or anything that you're going to be looking at through that. They're going to be bringing that with the indirect -1 to hit buff. And they also have really good artillery, really have good like use of the idea of combination units. So it's going to be sending all your infantry squad up, doing a bunch of commands, sitting there, and then having your tank line also slowly move back up to do tons and tons of rail fire, while your artillery sit in the back and just do tons of very weird stuff. And you basically are building for an overwhelming list. You're building for an overwhelming sense of firepower, an overwhelming sense of just basically things they have to deal with, and things like It's just basically all their stratagems, all the detachments, and all their abilities makes them shooting more or shooting better. So if you really like the idea of bringing like a lot of tanks, a lot of artillery and infantry squads, and moving them up and working in unison to create like mayhem on the battlefield and just like level head your opponent, I would highly recommend Imperial Guard. And also, if you just like building massive tanks and you like building lots of shock troopers, lots of Death Corp Creed soldiers, lots of like weird kind of cool big human units and like weird sentinel units, then I would highly recommend you move into Imperial Guard. And they also have just some cool minis like the Lord Solar, who gives like one free command point per command phase and gives like tons and tons of like command point like command shouts you can give your infantry squads to allow them to just be better in general. So Lord Solar is also a massive one. Now, what are some of their weaknesses you're going to be looking at playing Imperial Guard? Well, basically, they can be kept in their deployment zone. Because of their movement and the fact that you're running a lot of tanks, a lot of your points are going to be taken up with a lot of tanks. So the enemy has quite high movement. They're going to be easily able to keep you in your deployment zone and really have time getting out of your deployment zone. Because if you have enough units, it's very hard to deal with, even with tons of shots. It can be quite difficult dealing with quite large horde armies, especially if the slowness of them is keeping them in their if you're keeping them in their deployment zone, it's very hard to deal with them. And things like units that can deal really well with infantry, especially, so some of the anti-infantry guns or the anti-vehicle guns, or things that are able to easily keep them at bay and stop them from shooting. Most armies have access to those kind of things. So the idea of taking a lot of infantry and taking a lot of tanks can be countered with, well, anti-infantry and anti-tank. So if your enemy takes over the board, and it's very hard to get it back because suddenly you need to move all your units up, and all of a sudden that can be quite hard considering most of your points are taken up by tanks, and in terms you're looking at a struggle to moving up. So basically, you want to get ahead of the board, or your army's going to catch, or your enemy's army is going to catch up to you really quickly and deal with you very fast, whether that be keeping you in your deployment zone or blocking you out of objective markers. But yeah, that's Imperial Guard. Basically, lots of guns, lots of tank, and lots of infantry. So if you like playing your regular man-to-man soldier and just want to play more of like those kind of cool, regular, just massive tank units, weird, cool walker units, and some infantry, and some interesting infantry unit, then you can easily join in with the Imperial Guard. But let's move on to the next Imperium faction. Next, we move on to the Adeptus Custodes, or the elite of the elite. Basically, the Emperor's chosen guard, the soldiers who are supposed to be the most roughest, toughest, elite-centric units in the entire 40k universe. They should be able to tear down any foe that is thrown against them, as they are, after all, the Emperor's protectors and the Emperor's guard. Now, how do they play in the actual tabletop scene? Now, Custodes played very heavily into the idea of elite units. So you might not be taking vast amounts of them, and you might be taking very small numbers, like 6 or 5 or maybe even 4 squads, but the units you are taking are going to be very, very good at what they do, whether that be through tanking, killing, shooting, you name it, they're going to be pretty much good at all of them. Now, let's talk about some of their strengths. When you have a low amount of unit count, your control of the board becomes a lot better. I don't mean actual board control, but I mean your control over your units. So suddenly, you only have a couple of decisions to make, and the decisions you can make become a lot easier to make, because suddenly they have a greater chance of making. Like most Custodes will naturally save on a 3, unless you save on a 2, and most of them have like a 4-up invulnerable save, and most of them hit on 2-ups with melee or 3-ups with melee. They can do a lot of melee damage and easily some good shooting damage, as they are very elite focused. Now, their army rule, I believe the Martial Kata, or I think it's called that, basically allows you to choose from multiple melee buffs. So you can basically decide in what decision you need to play in. So you can go from lethal hits, sustain hits, basically sustain hits, lethal hits, mortal wounds, you name it, you get that melee hit. Basically allowing you to be flexible in terms of melee combat. So allowing your characters to focus on delivering, giving big buffs to your Terminator squads or your Warden squads, and then dealing heavy amounts of melee damage in terms of, okay, we need more attacks, we get more attacks. We need our attacks to land heavily against this vehicle, we get our attacks to land heavily against this vehicle. It will happen, as the Martial Kata is very powerful at dealing with anything that's thrown. They also have very, very good stratagems, like the ability to resurrect a custody, to have big buffs against monsters and vehicles, and to fight first, especially with their martial guitar, which allows you to get like lethal hits, sustain hits. It can be very, very good to continuously be able to fight first for like that 2 or 1 CP stratagem that you need to spend on them. They're also big bricks of Warden and big bricks of Alaris Custodes and big bricks of Terminators are going to be like huge benefits for you. It's what you're going to be mainly taking, and they are crazy great damage output, and they're probably like the best unit you can get in Custodes. They're going to be hitting so hard, going to be the majority of your army, and it's what's going to be taking up like so much ability for you to just perform. They're also crazy tanky, so if you really like tanky, more elite style units, Custodes is going to be very, very good for you. Most of their units, save on a 2-up, are getting like T6 to T7 toughness, and like have basically like a 4-up invulnerable save just naturally from the army. And what's good is that because they're an elite army, you don't really have to paint or build many of them. So you're looking at like a very consistent amount of just like, okay, I don't need that much. I have a couple of squads to build, but if you're looking at it from a more like, okay, don't really want to go fully into the hobby side, but I want to play a really good hard-hitting melee army, then Custodes are going to be very good for you. Now, what are some of their weaknesses? They're not a very great option for shooting, and the dedicated shooting units are quite terrible. Some of the things like their Custodes Dreadnought, or like their Rhinos, or like some of their female units, I forgot what they're called, but like, and even the shooting on the regular like Wardens or like Custodian or the Alaris Custodes are quite bad. So you're going to be looking at very heavily centrating yourself around melee and not going to have a lot of shooting buffs in terms of, okay, I need to shoot, and flexibility wise, you're not going to get a lot from shooting. And also, you don't really have a big range of models, so the chances of predictability when terms of, okay, the Alaris Custodes weaknesses is this, okay, I'll take this when I'm versing Custodes, is a very high chance, which is one of the downsides to elite units, but hey, that's what happens when you take kind of more elite-focused things. And not having a lot of shooting makes it hard to work around actual shooting armies, so suddenly, even if you are super, super tough, when you're going up against like Strength 10, Strength 12 weapons, it can be super deadly, especially if you're only taking like a couple of squads, where you're going up against like more heavy eccentric shooting armies, it can be quite deadly. But obviously, Custodes do have workarounds in terms of like doing massive amounts of like anti-vehicles and having crazy amounts of like lethal hits and reviving Custodes with like some of their stratagems. And they have a hard time stopping enemies from scoring secondaries. They don't really have a lot of movement units. Their biker units kind of suck, so you're not really going to take them. And so, once your units are scoring secondaries, it's very hard to stop them from scoring secondaries. And their options for cheap units don't really work. So unlike other elite units, they don't really have a very good way of making it around the board. So you kind of have to get into combat fast to stop the enemy from scoring secondaries and maxing out points through that. But yeah, that is basically Adeptus Custodes. Super, super elite focused army is going to be going heavily into melee, basically making their army as best they possibly can, charging in and doing tons and tons of damage through melee and tanking that while sitting on objectives. But yeah, so if you're interested in that, then I would highly recommend Adeptus Custodes. But who are we going to move on next into the Imperium masses? The next army is going to be the Grey Knights, or the Teleporting Fanatics, basically who were once the Emperor's Grand Protectors, but are now replaced by Custodes, now go around and hunt every single demon and try and eradicate demons away from the Emperor's general reign and try and reduce the demon threat to as little as possible with many psychic powers, whether that be through shooting or melee or just psychic enhanced weapons, which most of their army is. They heavily focus into fighting and killing demons. Now, how do they actually play? Now, Grey Knights play very differently to other armies. Their playstyle works very heavily into the idea of teleportation. So it's basically leading the enemy into a teleporting threat and then dealing a bunch of assault damage or outscoring the enemy through secondaries or holding objectives, like with sticky objectives, as much as they possibly can. So maybe not doing as much damage, but definitely outmaneuvering the enemy through teleportation, sticky objectives, and just maxing out secondaries like investigate signals or deploy teleport armies. Now, what about some of their strengths? They also orientate, like I said, towards scoring more than killing. So if you don't really necessarily like doing a lot of damage, but you want to do a more flexible army in terms of scoring, then Grey Knights are a great option. They can still do a lot of killing, but they're more oriented towards, okay, I need to teleport here, I need to teleport over here, and scoring secondaries and like holding primary through that with their decently high OC. They are also a decently elite unit, similar to Custodes, but on definitely a lesser scale. So you're going to be taking a lot less of them, but the units you are taking are going to be like saving on 2s, are going to have invulnerable saves, are going to be hitting on like 3s for melee, are going to have incredible toughness like T5 or T6, and are going to be doing crazy amounts of damage just in general for whatever you're going to be doing them. Now, their teleporting assault army rule basically allows you to pick up a unit per game and place them anywhere 9 inches away from an enemy unit. So you can pair that with the rapid egress stratagem to suddenly pick them up and place them straight back down whenever you freaking need them. So suddenly it's very good at repositioning the army in terms of, okay, I need them over here, I'll have them over there. So if you really like the idea of like not really playing by the rules and going outside of the terms and like going, okay, I want to teleport, I want to be over here right now, it's very easy to do that, especially when their whole rule around it. And their attachment rule basically just allows them to move a lot faster, and a lot of their abilities like Mist of Demos or other stratagems they have work very heavily into the idea of, okay, we're going to be teleporting, and we're going to be teleporting right goddamn now. And they're also an incredibly durable army, especially with Psychic. They love Psychic weapons. If you like Psychic weapons, Grey Knights are going to be a full-store option for you. They love, basically all their weapons are Psychic weapons. They all have abilities to make Psychic weapons do devastating wounds, or make Psychic weapons hit on 5, or critical hits on 5s, or making sustain or Psychic weapons better. So they're really good at manipulating the idea of Psychic weapons, working with the warp really well, and teleporting around and just doing weird things throughout the game and basically breaking all the rules that you don't want to know. And they're also really good at holding objective, which basically allows you to basically allows you to just hold objectives really well. They have quite good OC in terms of, okay, like I think it's 2 OC for the Paladin squad each, and then the regular Strike squad has like 1 or 2, which can be really good, especially when you get the Paladin Soulfire stratagem, which allows you to not be shot from 12 inches. It's very helpful to be like, okay, I'm teleporting over here and there's nothing you can do about it. So in terms of being a very flexible unit, in terms of moving and then not having any damage done to you, Grey Knights are going to be a great option for you. Now, in terms of weaknesses, their lack of damage can get quite annoying. If you need to really kill something, it can be quite annoying because then suddenly you have to put pressure away from teleporting, which is kind of like your whole gist, and it can quite annoying to use that for like any form of purpose. And your teleporting can be a block to a lot of screening units. So if you're trying to get your enemy to stop the screen, it's very hard to find like cheaper units to screen with, but obviously you don't really need to screen because you can just teleport. But having cheaper units similar to Custodes can be very hard, so having any unit to just stay there and do something can be very centrally hard, especially when you're trying to take as many units with an elite kind of force as possible. And their shooting is really blah. They really have no shooting whatsoever besides like the Nemesis Dreadnought and like the Brotherhood Knight, or like the baby carrier, and who has some decently okay shooting. You can get like devastating wounds with a psychic ability with a stratagem, but still their shooting is pretty meh. So if you're looking at playing a teleporting fanatic army who loves moving, breaking all the rules, coming in where they feel like it, and then not being shot, having a sticky objective, and having some hard-hitting melee weapons who are heavily centricate on Psychic, then I'm going to say Grey Knights are for you. But who's going to be the next Imperium army on our big one? Now we move on to the bigger side of the Imperium, which is going to be the Imperial Guard, or as I call them, the 5 big death robots. Basically, massive metal forged walkers that have built off ancient lore and stories that are created simply for the idea of death machine. I believe the soldiers are actually soldered inside the walkers to deliver nothing but desolation and destruction inside the Imperium itself and go up against even the most defying of forces. Basically, massive death robots. So, in the actual tabletop game, they work very similarly as, okay, you're taking a very small army.
Before we continue into the rest of the Imperial Knights, I just need to show you this one clip I found. It's a bit of a meme, and it starts off pretty strange, but trust me, once you watch through, you'll absolutely thank me for getting it to. It's way too funny to miss.
Single as I can be, you're single, perfect for me. I'm gonna give you a
Titans of God shall end this war. Symbols and ancient lore.
Now, back onto the regular video. By the way, I couldn't stop wetting myself after I watched that video.
Like 4, 5, 6 models. Models, not units, models. So you are going with a very small army, but the units you are taking are very good at what they do, whether that be through shooting, OC control, toughness, save value, everything. It's very, very good. It's like Custodes on steroids. So instead of taking 10 units, you're taking 5. But instead of them being very good, they're very, very good units. So you're going to be going with a very, very elite-focused army where you're going to have not many units, but the units you are taking are going to be very good at just generally everything. Now, they're very straightforward in the terms of how they play. You can see very obviously that they do carry a lot of shots, whether that be through direct missile fire or Gatling guns or large blasters or energy weapons that can have up to D6 plus 8 damage, which is insane. Or they can have plenty of melee options as well in terms of their stomp or their chain sweep or some of their claws or anything they're going to throw at them, or just like fist. I'm going to have 2 options of very, very powerful melee and shooting attacks. And most of them, especially some of like the more Gatling versions of them, are going to have insane amounts of shooting power. Now,
sorry everybody watching, my lovely Wi-Fi decided to cut out and I was unable to edit the rest of the video for the returning of the Knights and the Sister Battle, so there will be no more editing for the rest of the video as you continue to watch it, besides maybe a few transitions here and there, what I was able to do that I've already downloaded. But yeah, if you want to click off, that's fine because there will be no more editing, but just giving you a warning in case you know, surprised where did all the cool fancy pictures go. But yeah, enjoy.
Now, their army ability is basically the Code Chivalric, which basically allows them to complete deeds throughout the game. And as they complete these deeds, they basically they gain things. They gain abilities, whether this be like, okay, you gain 3 CP, or if you kill the warden or capture the enemy outpost, or like if you do very specific things, you get very specific things back. So basically, you're completing codes of honor. You're completing these deeds, these acts, these variant like contributing that gives you these buffs, these massive abilities, and you gain back from basically doing that. So if you complete these insane amounts of triumphs, you get that huge reward back. For example, killing the warlord or capturing the enemy outpost. Next, it's going to be they're basically crazy tanky units. They got like 22 wounds each. They're carrying in with like D6 plus 8 damage. Like you get like a 5 or feel no pain. Some of their abilities work with AP modifiers, and they're very, very chivalric. -1 to AP modifiers, and also being super Titanic walkers means that they are able to walk over things that are under 4 inches tall, which means that screening them is also a pain in the ass. So if you are really looking at running a massive robotic mechanized heavy walker kind of army where you run like maybe like 6 or 3 units, but those units are very good at what they do and they're going to have a lot of value, going to be very hard to kill, then Imperial Knights are going to be very, very good for you. And if you really like the idea of completing these codes of honor and really aiming towards doing something throughout the game, then I would also, because that's what Imperial Knights do very, very well. Now, some of their weaknesses is that only having 6 units, even if they're good, means that you have less board control. It means that the idea of controlling the board is a lot naturally harder, because suddenly, even if you do have the more Knight Squire units, the smaller, more advanceable units, it's still hard to have board control, especially when you're versing more of a horde-based army. It can seem impossible to do anything. So having that little control over an objectives that you need can also be very, very painful. Now, they did get some big nerfs in terms of like what they can do with their damage output and their OC control, so it can be very hard to play with them, especially with their ability to complete the deeds they need to complete. It can just become a lot harder to actually fulfill their army rule. And they have lots of keywords. Example, they've got like the vehicle keyword, the walker keyword, they've got the heavy walker keyword, so things like who can come in with the anti-vehicles are going to be horrible against this unit because suddenly you're getting the hitting on falls, you get sustained hits, it's horrible, devastating wounds is even worse, and basically it's just kind of like hard. It's hard to operate with them. But one cool thing you can do, which I believe is kind of like a downside and upside, is their Free Bladers ability, which allows you to take basically these knights in a regular Imperial army. So if you are running like Space Marines, for example, you run a Space Marines and you want an Imperial Knight in there, you can run an Imperial Knight in there. But the only thing is, I believe this is a good side because it brings in the heavy firepower of the Night Walker, but in return, it becomes a lot harder to play with them, and suddenly the idea becomes less accentuated on the actual knight and more about involving it in your army in the first place. So it can be good, but if you like the idea of taking them with them, and you love these knight units and you want to take them in like your Space Marine army, then you can run them in with the Free Bladers ability, but you have to look up that based on how many points you're allowed to take. But yeah, that's going to be Imperial Knights, basically massive mechanized walkers who love desecrating the field and completing codes of honor to earn back basically their CP or earn back something throughout the game that they need to complete. But yeah, that's going to be one Imperial army. Now let's move on to the next Imperial army. Now we are moving on to the Adeptus Sororitas, or the nuns with guns. Basically, these soldiers were told that they could never, ever, ever have men at arms. So they took that so literally that they now run women at arms and force men to be tortured to control larger robotic equipment to run into battle and desecrate themselves to destroy the enemy. Basically, just nuns with guns. Now, as a playstyle, they're very, very fragile, more fragile kind of elite units who play very heavily into close quarters firepower, whether this be through flamer or melter weapons. They do very, very well with that. Now, their strength is that they're very, very good at close range. The Adeptus Sororitas are very good at closing this distance and being very good at very short range. So if you really like the idea of moving in with maybe like shooting, but having like a lot of flamers, a lot of melter weapons, a lot of Gatling weapons, then I would recommend Adeptus Sororitas in the term of like as well of like the buffs you get from the character models that are giving to you and applying to the infantry squads, especially a lot of the flamer infantry squads, can be very desecrating on like holding an OC point, wiping it clean to move the rest of your heavier, more like maybe fragile glass cannon units up and get in. Their ability is basically Acts of Fate, which is the army ability, which allows you to roll miracle dice, which basically allows you to roll a set of miracle dice at the start of the game, and as you're going throughout the game, you can choose to roll more miracle dice based on acts you do. So if a Adeptus Sororitas model dies, then you can roll some more miracle dice. So if you complete a specific act, you get more miracle dice. And the point of the miracle dice is that during the game, you can assign those dice to like another dice you rolled. So for example, if you roll like a huge Overwatch load, and then suddenly you got a bunch of 5s and you need like one more 6 and you got a 6 on your miracle dice, you can choose to trade out those dices and you choose to trade the dices and get rid of the 5 and add in the 6 and use that as your dice model. It's a very interesting mechanic that can work very, very well in terms of like basically making situations work really well for you. So suddenly if you need something to work really well, you can use tons of miracle dice to make that operation work and just basically just allow it to work really well. And some of their attachments, like the Sanity Exemplar, allows you to get more miracle dice based on just like just by doing more acts. So having just more acts allows you to be just crazy good at just whatever you're doing. A lot of their like more castle and transport units are really good. They have some really nice jetpack units I know in the back there. I keep forgetting their names, but they've got a lot of characters in terms, so if you're looking at playing a more character dense list, they're also a great option. I don't know a lot of the sisters' names, but they do have a large extent of units, especially some of their weird tortured units, like the running one, and they have one where people are strapped with strips and they've got like tormented. It's quite weird, but it's actually got some cool units though. And also they have a great Overwatch, considering that most of their units are turret weapons, means they automatically hit. It's fantastic for getting in that like, okay, crazy Overwatch, crazy close range combat, awesome abilities to move into that with the Miracle Dice, allowing for certain situations to happen really well for you. So if you're really interested in like close range combat with a bunch of characters assisting that, transporting your units, getting some more jetpacks, fighting in close range combat with melter and flamer weapons, and then coming in with me to make certain situations work really, really well for you, literally, Sisters of Battle or Adeptus Sororitas are going to be really, really good for you. Now, what are their weaknesses? I believe their weaknesses is that the Miracle Dice can roll weird. You can get a really, really bad Miracle Dice roll, and it can be horrible for you. So suddenly, it does, once again, deploy on chance. So if you get like a bunch of 1s, that's kind of like not too good. Obviously, you are rolling like 12, I think, up to 12, I believe you're rolling, so it can be quite interesting to see how you're going to work in that. And you don't really have a huge range of special abilities. Like, in terms of how much damage you're bringing through the idea of buffs and continuous accolations through, like, Bolt of Fire, through close range combat, you're not really getting a lot of that. So most of your weapons, damage is going to be coming from just, like, regular guns, regular infantry squads, and just regular shooting areas. Now, basically, in this example, they're not a very tanky unit, and will definitely have a lot harder holding down points. It's very hard to take a lot of them without them dying. So you have to be ready to give up a lot of them in terms of holding down an objective. And basically, what this comes down to is that the fact that they are hit pretty decently hard, but the units you're taking are going to be very, very fragile. So you need to be able to understand that, okay, I have these units who are very, very weak. How can I position them in the way it's going to, like, obviously, maybe they're going to probably die, but they're going to shoot very, very well, so they get that Miracle Dice opponent off and do very well in the game. But yeah, that's Adeptus Sororitas, basically nuns with guns with crazy amount of close range, quarters firepower, and ability to make certain situations work really well for you, and some pretty